Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Greetings from my kitchen, aka the DataGovHub World Headquarters. We're just going to wait a minute so that more people can be let in, because it looks like we need to do that. So thank you for your patience. Wow, this is moving slowly today. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so welcome to webinar number 4. And thank you so much for joining us today here in Arlington, Virginia. It's pretty nasty out. I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors at GW, the Internet Society, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Web Foundation, and thank you so much for joining us. So today we're privileged to have 2 scholars who are also activists. And so I'd like to welcome you and Dr. Courtney Radsch and Professor David Kaye to our webinar. David Kaye is a professor at University of California at Irvine Law School, where he directs the International Justice Clinic, and he's also the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. We are also delighted to welcome Dr. Courtney Radsch, who is the Advocacy Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and who's done a lot of scholarships on freedom of expression and opinion as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of questions that I'm going to ask them briefly, and then we will open the floor up to your questions, and I hope you'll begin by posing those questions when you're ready. So, guys, the public debate in many countries seems to be oriented towards a human rights balancing act, where governments try to achieve some sort of balance between protecting the rights to privacy and protecting public health. And could you talk about how governments should advance human rights in the time of the pandemic? Courtney, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I think that it's really important that in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic that we actually reframe how we're thinking about human rights, because obviously the right to life, the right to health are human rights, as are freedom of expression, privacy. These need to be, we need to look at how we can respect these human rights, all of them, during this time, because we have seen how too often during unprecedented times, during national crises, for example, like September 11th or the War on Terror, that the civil rights, political rights, and human rights have been abrogated under the assumption that there had to be either security or human rights. And I think we're seeing in many cases the same equation being done here. It's either respect freedom of expression and privacy, or we combat coronavirus. And actually that's just not true. And I think David's going to talk a little bit more about the human rights framework in terms of proportionality and necessity. But what we're seeing is around the world, in democratic and authoritarian countries alike, that leaders are using coronavirus to put on extremely severe restrictions on freedom of information, on the right to free expression. They are passing laws that criminalize aspects of journalism, that criminalize the dissemination or sharing of false news, which in many cases is not defined well. And as we know, what we know about coronavirus and COVID-19 has been evolving. So even determining, what is the truth is very challenging in this evolving novel situation. And so we're really concerned about the use of disinformation laws, false news laws, emergency laws that criminalize publication of any statistics that don't comport with the official version, because the fact is, in many cases, the official version is not accurate. For example, in Iran, in China, in Russia, or there isn't enough information to determine whether or not that information is correct. So, we're seeing that journalists, human rights defenders, and more broadly the public, because these laws also criminalize sharing, on social media, a lot of people sharing the latest information that they've seen. So we're seeing that indeed this problematic framing of a balancing is going on, but human rights barely has any weight on its side, I would say.
Just elaborate on that last point. Has any weight on its side?
If we think about balancing, so think about a seesaw. I would say that in the vast majority of the debates and the conversations around these issues, we're hearing about the need for contact tracing, about the need to assure public health, about making sure that people maintain social distancing, that they stay in quarantine. And then what we're not hearing about is that if we're going to deploy new technologies, new surveillance capacities, that we need to have restrictions and limitations on there. We're seeing a lot of laudatory praise being given out to China, to South Korea, to Israel, to these countries that have potentially managed to stave the spread of the virus and have deployed very invasive surveillance technologies that can track individual level movements, whether they've gone outside of quarantine, who they've met with through both mobile phone, facial recognition, and other sort of technologically inflected devices to track all of this information. And what you very rarely hear in any of this coverage is that there need to be very clear limitations on who has access to that data. How can that data be used? How long can that data be stored? How long will that provision allowing that type of surveillance be allowed? Is there a sunset clause? And we, again, going back to 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, we should remember that the vast surveillance powers that we gave the United States government resulted in a vast surveillance net that was used to spy on people around the world. And we saw that governments around the world used anti-terrorism laws as an excuse to crack down on independent journalism, critics of the regimes, government critics, opposition forces. We must not let coronavirus and the response to COVID-19 become a cover for restricting our human rights.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, so first off, Susan, thanks to you and your colleagues for organizing this. It's always great to be on a panel. Usually they're in person with Courtney. Courtney's Californian too, so we have this simpatico going on here, I think. So I want to take off where Courtney started and actually ended, and it's on the question that you mentioned around balancing. One of the things that we've seen for years really is, and this has been particularly acute in the context of efforts against terrorism, is that the issues and the concerns are framed as either this or that, where we get the balancing, right? It's either security or liberty. And I think that we're in a phase now where we could very easily fall into that trap also. It's either public health or it's freedom of expression. It's either public health or it's a robust media that's able to report on all of these different issues. And I think that's entirely the wrong way to look at these, as much as Courtney was suggesting as well. Human rights law, and so my little pitch for human rights law, right? Article 19 of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it protects, really in a robust way, everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And then in a subsequent paragraph in the ICCPR, the International Covenant, it also says that states may impose limitations, but those limitations have to be very narrowly drawn. They have to be provided by law. That means they can't be vague. They can't provide excessive discretion to public authorities to make restrictions. And perhaps most importantly, they have to be necessary and proportionate in order to protect a legitimate objective. So that means that when we're looking at different restrictions around the world, the kinds that Courtney mentioned, we should be asking, is that restriction necessary in order to protect, excuse me, public health? And that, it gives us, the law gives us a tool to move away from the balancing and to really force, or to at least demand, that governments provide their explanation, their reasoning, but also their evidence for why a particular step is necessary. This holds true whether we're talking about restrictions on the media, on reporters and their ability to report. It holds true for public assembly as well, but it also holds true for things like surveillance, which, as we know, and as Courtney has done real important work on, it has a real impact not only on our privacy, but also on our ability and our willingness to share information and seek information. It has a direct impact on our freedom of expression. So, I very much want to move and hope that we can move the conversation, not just ours, I mean the global conversation, away from balancing of rights and more to asking, if we're going to protect this right, how do we do it in a way that is consistent with and respectful of other rights as well?
And I would even like to see human rights as even part of the story. I'm concerned that so much of the coverage about the responses don't even include any consideration, much less a balancing. So, I think there's kind of a two-step solution that we need. We need one, to bring in to the conversation the human rights dimension, the fact that we need to think about this. And then secondly, make sure that it's framed correctly so that it doesn't make this false.
I agree with that too. And I would say that to the extent, and this is a challenge for all of us really, to the extent that we can focus in on specific rights, that's really essential. I think that, too often, we talk, I don't mean CPJ or anybody in particular, but like the overall environment, it treats human rights as a generic concept without content. But human rights and human rights law is actually a really dense and rich set of guidelines, of rules, of laws that can help us think about these really hard issues. And to the extent that we can really focus in, and that's where the necessity and proportionality principles can be extremely helpful, to the extent we can focus in on the very specific questions that are before us. For example, CPJ has been leading on this really important point that all journalists should be released from prison at this particular moment. It shouldn't just be a demand for the release. It should be, look, when reporters are in prison, not only is that a public health threat, but that's an excessive penalty on an already excessively penalized group of people. And I think when we think about it in those very specific terms and in terms of the audience's right to access information, that allows us, in terms of the narrative, which I think is really important that Courtney mentioned, that narrative can be really maybe more clearly understood by a broader audience.
Thank you. Well, can we get back to the point that you ended with, and Courtney, the framing? So when we talk about data governance, people tend to focus on specific human rights, like the right to privacy. Could you talk about the broader human rights framing? And for example, people may not be aware of probably most of the people on this webinar, but broader human rights that are affected during this pandemic?
Sure. I mean, just to talk, I mean, I think as as we look around the world at how, you know, COVID-19 is having an impact. I released a report just last Friday on COVID-19 and freedom of expression, and you know, in part, I think we can think of this in two different ways. Like, one is there is a legitimate public need to deal with, to confront, to address the coronavirus itself. Right? There's a very important, I think, you know, broadly recognized importance of dealing with the pandemic. There's sort of separate that is the opportunism that we see many governments using in order to say, look, you know, we're going to do this for public health purposes, but in fact, what they may be doing is reinforcing repressive tendencies or goals that they've had for years. I mean, we've seen this in many places right now. Perhaps, you know, at least for Europeans, the prime example may be Hungary right now, where the trend lines have been has been really awful for freedom of expression, for free media, and for democratic debate, and they're being worsened in the context of the pandemic. So, you know, I think that as we think about how we evaluate what's going on out there, and how we evaluate the measures that states are taking, I think we can look at it from those two different perspectives. But again, part of the objective and part of the tool that we have in the necessity and proportionality standards is a framework for making demands for governments to justify the steps that they're taking. You know, whether they have an impact on life, on health, on the media, on elections, on all sorts of other issues that are really live for people, even during the pandemic. We shouldn't be kind of cowed into self-censoring simply because, you know, we think the pandemic is the overriding concern. Of course, it is the overriding concern for most people around the world right now, but that doesn't mean that it should be a kind of avalanche that buries all other rights.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just add to that. You know, on the one hand, we're seeing that, you know, for example, false news laws were already proliferating around the world, especially in the wake of the amplification of that idea by the President of the United States. So now we're seeing, you know, again, that more false news or disinformation laws are being passed, and that there is now cover for those laws that were passed in the first place that were problematic. And obviously those have wide impact on the people that they're used against. But also, if we think about, for example, even in the most rights respecting governments right now, we're seeing that there are discussions, according to a Reuters article yesterday, with 8 spyware firms, including groups like NSO Group and Celebrate, which have been implicated in severe human rights abuses against, I'm going to focus on journalists, but as well as others, but including in journalists and linked to journalists who have been murdered, including Khashoggi and Javier Valdez. You know, so it's really problematic. There are dozens of governments in talks with these spyware firms to have them create their surveillance apparatus. When you hear that, you become concerned that, you know, these governments are not thinking about the broader framework, what they're putting in place, even if they have the best intentions right now. You know, if once you've set up a technical capacity or you've demonstrated the ability to do some sort of surveillance or to get companies to do some sort of surveillance. What's very interesting also, to move away from surveillance, but thinking about, for example, freedom of expression online. we've seen that technology firms have moved increasingly to automated content moderation that is more, driven by machine learning and algorithmic intervention, and that they've been very aggressive in combating, what they consider misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. Well, this is now proof of concept for being much more aggressive and using algorithmic interventions for other type of content. There has been a lot of pressure on them from the US and Europe and elsewhere to be much more proactive on removing extremist content, for mitigating, violent extremism online, et cetera. So once you create the capacity to do something, that can then be used for other means. And I think that's what we need to be very vigilant about and concerned about. So when we hear, just like this morning on NPR, this, very sophisticated techniques that are being used in some countries to trace the coronavirus and mitigate the expansion of the virus, which we all desperately want. We need to think about what are the frameworks for making sure that that is not used to abrogate other human rights, and that that's not then setting up a system that can be misused. Whether you're in democratic or authoritarian countries, because democratic countries can become authoritarian. You mentioned Hungary, perfect example.
Yes, thank you for that. Just quickly, can you talk a little bit about what your organization are doing to ensure that governments are getting correct information to their people? We've seen some governments actually suppress information about the virus. We've seen our own government promulgate misinformation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a couple of words. Basically focused on my role with the UN. So for those who aren't familiar with it, the Human Rights Council, which is the central human rights body of the UN system, it's a part of the General Assembly. It selects what are known as special rapporteurs, human rights working groups, independent experts who monitor freedom of expression or whatever other human right might be the subject of their mandate around the world. And we do this in a few different ways. We communicate directly with governments, which means sending them a letter when we have a concern. Those become public. And we also do press statements from time to time on particular issues. We do country visits, although we're not doing country visits right now, obviously. And we do annual reports or thematic reports on particular issues. Around all of these things, it's common for us to file amicus pleadings in regional and national courts on issues that pertain to freedom of expression. So, or the other area that somebody is mandated to monitor. So, I mean, one thing I would say is I would encourage people as they perceive violations, in my context, violations of the freedom of expression, they should report them. I mean, that can be as simple as an email to me or to my colleagues who work at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and we can kind of monitor that, be in touch with the government, and so forth. And I think that's an important tool for us to use that only really works when individuals reach out to us and let us know of the concerns that they have. I think it can be effective, but it, of course, also depends on the government and how willing the government is to engage on human rights issues with us. Unfortunately, all too often, when we raise our concerns with the government, they ignore us. We go public. They complain about going public. So it's always kind of a tension over that with governments. But I think that by and large, we can have an impact, but only if it's part of a broader effort working with civil society organizations like CPJ, of course, and many others, so that no particular organization is working on its own in a particular field.
And what we're doing is, first of all, we're trying to report on the restrictions around not only disinformation, but also countries and localities that have restricted freedom of information or restricted their or kind of reduced their requirements to respond to freedom of information requests. That's really important because you want to be able to hold governments accountable, and part of that is through access to information. We're also essentially creating data. We are creating data about the restrictions that are imposed, about what the legal or regulatory frameworks that are allowed to impose those restrictions, data on arrests, on quarantine. There's so much information. We talk about data, but actually, I'm realizing in my job how data poor we are in many cases. We're having to just very manually, report on these incidents, try to understand, what the framework is for that, media monitoring. But just because we talk a lot about big data and we talk about surveillance should not obfuscate the fact that there's actually a vast lack of data in many cases, and the creation of that data and the gathering of that data can be very labor intensive, but it's very important for, going back to your question, Susan, holding governments accountable for their responses. And we'll see that, more broadly, I think, as well, even with these, very cool apps and initiatives, and tech platforms and, surveillance initiatives. There are data deserts, right? There are communities that are not typically going to be counted right. There are, huge implications for how we gather and collect data and what is considered data as we seek to combat, this virus. To that end, one of the things we're also trying to do is highlight how this virus and the response of the virus is impacting freelance journalists, which are a really important part of the ecosystem. And in fact, there's so little data on them, but we know that, and actually the International Federation for Journalists just put out a survey today, that these freelance journalists are finding their livelihoods are decimated. News outlets are not hiring them anymore. They don't provide them with protective equipment to go out and report. But again, if we think about data deserts, and a lot of what we know and think about of how to respond depends on having that data at hand, which is important for holding also governments accountable. We don't have enough data. We don't know, for example, in many countries, are journalists going to be considered essential workers? We're trying to do that, on a case-by-case basis, but it's not like there's a database that exists out there on that. So, it's then hard to know whether you're allowed to move about and go report. We don't know whether freelancers are going to be considered, for government support regimes in terms of, the financing and tax support that we're seeing with the whole gig economy and all of that. So, there are huge troves of data that need to be collected and need to be analyzed in order to make those governments accountable, be able to address the vast repercussions of this coronavirus.
Thank you, Courtney. Okay, so I'm going to go to our questions, and I'm going to read them and type the answers. So here's interesting to begin with. As practitioners, any thoughts to how the general public can become better educated and motivated to participate in the process of reporting on human rights during the pandemic? Anyone want to take that?
Sure. I think that the general public, I think this is the time to really focus on media and information literacy, on understanding where you get your information and how that's impacted. It is a very, very challenging time right now when you have public officials that are actively conveying disinformation. And so, educating yourself about that, about where information, learning, more about basic science, about basic math and statistics, that's going to be helpful for helping you participate. And I think, I like David's suggestion that, thinking about, well, how can I, if I'm seeing my rights being violated, or I'm seeing other rights being violated, how can I report that? How can I make that visible? And then, you know, I think that going back to what David mentioned, the Free the Press campaign that we're running right now, like there are, according to our last census, at least 250 journalists in prison in about 24 countries. Those journalists are at risk of essentially having a death sentence because they cannot self-quarantine, they can't practice good hygiene. Oftentimes in many countries, they can't really get access to food or supplies because visitors are cut off. And obviously the issue of journalists in prison, everyone in prison is at risk. I'm focused on journalists because I work for the Committee to Protect Journalists, but there are prisoners of conscience. There are political prisoners around the world. And, you know, if you want to get involved, please sign our petition. It's on change.org/freethepress. Get involved. I think Amnesty has a campaign around political prisoners. The ACLU is working on prisoners in the US. You know, you can make a difference. It actually does help when you do that retweet, when you share that Facebook post, especially, you know, when you can help amplify that beyond our community of activists and, you know, advocates here, and show that there is support for caring about surveillance. Call into your local radio program and ask a question that has to do with human rights. There are many ways that you as an individual can take small, meaningful steps in your daily life.
Let me correct this one.
If I could just, I just want to add, because I think that's all really important what Courtney just said. And I would also say that there's certainly a role that the question might be leading us towards, a role for the media. I would say particularly for the broadcast media and for social media to play in all of this. I mean, from the broadcast media, I think one of the things that we can be thinking about is, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, you'll see that I think both Courtney and I are opposed to binaries. Like these aren't either or questions. And so just to give an example, particularly for an American audience, the issue of the coverage of Trump's, I guess their press conferences that are daily events right now. And the debate is often seen as a kind of, you know, in order to educate the public, should these be broadcast or not? But I don't think that's really the right way of thinking about the possibilities. I mean, it may be that it's possible. I mean, of course it's possible for broadcast media to say, we're not going to carry it live because of the potential for disinformation, which we've seen come from this president, or in the context of kind of just the use of the media as a kind of campaigning tool. That, you know, another approach is for broadcast media to show it later with the context around it. I mean, broadcast media has tools of contextualizing and editorializing. It can be really essential to help educate the public, particularly in a moment of public health crisis. And I think the same could be said for social media as well. There's always this demand for social media to take down content. But, you know, social media has a lot of different tools. And I think part of our educating ourselves is to, you know, look at, well, like, what are those other tools, and to be encouraging social media, you know, through the different mechanisms that we have, you know, use our voice to encourage them to be responsible, to do human rights due diligence in order to make sure that the processes that they're adopting are transparent and consistent with the rights of users. And then, you know, by doing that, I think they can be playing, you know, a stronger role in ensuring that we're educated. And I think that's, you know, all of this requires our involvement, because if we don't engage, you know, both government and big corporate actors will just continue along the path that is, you know, basically the one of the greatest self-interest.
Thank you. So another questioner asks, she's concerned about COVID-inspired surveillance, and that she fears that will be invoked to protect, she fears that it will undermine local privacy laws. And she cites as example Google publicly releasing individual movement as tracked by Google Maps. I'm not familiar with individual movement there, but.
I mean, my understanding from Facebook, Google, and Twitter is that their data is not useful at the individual level to do tracking, and that they are, well, let me rephrase that. Twitter, I believe, has like 2%, has said it has only 2% of people who have turned on tweets with geolocation data. So that's kind of out at an individual level. Google and Facebook allow people to adjust their settings in terms of whether they're being tracked and whether that location data is being used. My understanding is that they are not allowing data to be used at an individual level, and they are claiming that, you know, the data that is being shared or could be shared would be aggregate level, you know, broad data. However, broad anonymized data. However, I would say that some recent reporting, for example, Charlie Wurzel's series in the New York Times that took geolocation data from cell phones and reverse engineered that with other existing public data sets to figure out individuals, as well as there's an article in Nature about reverse engineering, that, you know, even these claims about using aggregated anonymized data need to be seriously interrogated. So my understanding is at the moment that's the claim, but let's also be clear that, you know, Google has hardware, right? And Apple have hardware. So what I have understood, though I have not independently verified this with the companies, is that they are both looking at how they could install the capacity for other developers to develop APIs that would enable contact tracing apps to be installed and then used either via Bluetooth or via geolocation tracking. So there's a lot going on. It's very complicated, especially for those of us who are not technical experts. And so that's why, going back to, you know, some core fundamental human rights principles, we need to make sure that the, you know, whatever is being developed is being done transparently, that we have clear restrictions on how that data can be used, who has access to it. I mean, I hear, oh, we're developing it, you know, a capacity that anyone can have an API for. Look what happened when we did that with facial recognition. And now we have Clearview and these, you know, very sophisticated technologies that have now taken our facial recognition data and created these huge data sets that are being sold to law enforcement and kind of going around legal processes. So, you know, the big takeaway from whatever company or capacity we're talking about is that there needs to be a human rights assessment done in advance of the creation of that technology or the implementation of any sort of technological capacity. And then there need to be clear limitations in terms of use, in terms of access, and in terms of, you know, sunset clauses.
Do you want
to? I mean, I would just add, because I think everything that Courtney said was really right on and on point. You know, one of the things that we've been tracking for the last, tracking might not be the right word for it, but that we've been following for the last several years is the rise of the private surveillance industry. And so just to kind of amplify this point that Courtney was making, you know, there are many companies that have been involved in really problematic surveillance of journalists, of opposition figures, of others who are now jumping into, you know, the COVID-19 surveillance market. And, you know, while it's obviously going to be important for all sorts of disease intervention and disease surveillance principles to conduct contact tracing and to really surveil the spread of the disease, it's also critical that there be constraints on those companies, not only on their collection but also their sharing of that information. And again, we go back to basic principles, as Courtney suggested. What is necessary for the purposes of surveillance of the disease? For example, you know, if one of the companies gets access to communications or the metadata that can very easily identify your contacts. You know, how is that being used? How is that being used in the context of regimes that might not use these kinds of tools in a public health specific way, but might use them in ways to restrict the association of people who are in dissent, for example. So, I think I have those concerns, share the concerns that Courtney raised. I think we need to be very, very careful about what governments permit and what we permit governments to do.
And I would also add that we talk a lot about the kind of the tech platforms, the Google, Amazon, Twitter, et cetera. But there are many technologies. Think about, your Fitbit, your running app, your health app. I think there could be, if there isn't already, pressure to leverage data from those apps. The temperature apps, your phone has the ability to monitor so many of these functions. And so I'm waiting for the moment when, the powers that be discover that there's all this data out there that, yes, it could be used to figure out who has a temperature, cross-reference that with their face, where they have been, who they've seen, but it's much broader than just, the content platforms that we typically focus on. And that's why, the principles need to apply to all technologies. You need to do the human rights assessments in advance so that you're not figuring out, after the fact that your running app just revealed the location of all these US soldiers out on some base. I can't remember what country it was, in Afghanistan or whatever.
I just did a study of this. And then we had a webinar on this recently with a colonel from the US Army and Carrie Cordero, and definitely. Okay, so let me get to a few more questions. How can governments earn the public trust that they're making good and necessary collection and use of data?
That's a big question. I would say that they can earn our trust by doing what Courtney and I tell them to do. Right? I mean, governments. So one of the interesting things about the moment and around public health that I don't think we saw in the counterterrorism space, for example, is that the WHO's guidance, there's guidance from 2018, they issued a report called Managing Epidemics or Managing Global Epidemics, something like that. In that guidance, they were very, very clear that access to information and that a communication strategy is essential to dealing with the disease or with a disease or a pandemic. I mean, it's become popular. Probably everybody has heard the term infodemic now, but I think that kind of collapses things into one particular space around disinformation. The key thing that the WHO is suggesting, which I think is absolutely correct, is that governments need to be very clear. They need to be very honest with the information that they have. I mean, the way to develop trust with the public is to treat the public as, basically adults, right? Treat us as capable of making decisions, capable of analyzing, really, particularly at a moment of pandemic, as capable of assessing really uncertain information. And I think we really have seen that. I mean, two things. One, before the pandemic, governments have been doing all sorts of things to undermine public trust in the media, in public health authorities, in science. So, the pathogen kind of emerged into this environment of censorship already and into an environment of distrust. So that's where it emerged. And then we've seen over the last couple months, governments basically hiding the ball all too often. I mean, in the United States, we've seen that more from the federal level than from the states, but around the world, we've seen that as well. And And that goes, directly contrary to the WHO's guidance, which is share as much information as you can. Don't panic people, but be honest with the nature of the threat and the things that we need to be doing in order to address it. I think that kind of honesty and treatment of people as able to deal with these kinds of issues, that generates much more trust than the censorship approach, which really sows a lot of doubt in people's minds about the quality and nature of the information that's being shared.
Courtney, you want to add?
No, I think that he covered it.
Can you give an example of a government that you think is doing this better? For example, the New York Times has talked about the Swedish model. You've seen articles probably lauding the governments of New Zealand and Australia. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we mainly focus on governments that are doing bad things to journalists. So it's harder to understand where good things are happening. But I would say that, the issue of trust and kind of effective responses is linked. And so, you see, for example, I was talking with a journalist who works in Taiwan, and we've covered some journalists who work in South Korea also. We have to remember that this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in whatever the context is that country is in and that the world is in. And in many parts of Asia, that is SARS. And so there are these examples of where, these governments set up contact tracing and surveillance regimes to combat SARS. And then it appears that in some cases then got rid of those, or, they did not misuse them. And so that sets a good precedent, for the future. I was talking to this one journalist in Taiwan who was saying, we have a relatively high level of trust in our government. I mean, he's speaking on his, from his perspective, but I think that was interesting because that does then have an impact on the response. Similarly, in, parts of Europe where you have the governments who have actively been out there talking about the importance of privacy, who have passed legislation like the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, I think I got the acronym right. Have passed legislation to protect privacy. So they have pursued an approach to protecting human rights in the midst of kind of other actors who might abrogate them through their actions. So there's some level, I think, of trust, but I'm definitely not an expert on how governments are, reacting to COVID.
I also think it's, to a certain extent, it's a little early, but it's certainly early on the disease side because, I think what we're hearing from public health authorities is that, this isn't sort of a one wave kind of disease. There'll be multiple waves of it. And the second wave could be, more punishing and damaging than the first. So I think, I wouldn't want to, draw any firm conclusions about the states that are doing this well and the states that are not, in part because we want to keep monitoring them. But I do think, there are examples. I think Courtney's right to point out Asia. In South Korea, for example, because countries in Asia had this experience of SARS before and other disease epidemics, disease outbreaks, they've also already had this interaction with the public over, how to communicate the importance of, sanitary approaches and how to approach surveillance. And in South Korea, the example of how originally surveillance several years ago was seen as problematic in part because government was not sharing information about the nature of the data that they were collecting, that there was a significant amount of public distrust around that. And recently, South Korea, before the pandemic, South Korean law was changed to ensure that that data collection was also adequately described to people, and that people had a right to truth, essentially, a right to information about what was collected. So, I think the states that are going to succeed in building trust are going to be the ones not just that solve the problem of public health, but do it in a way that engages the public in a responsible way in solving the problem. And that means, ensuring that the journalists have real access to the information and the ability to impart that information, that they're not subject to constant attack by political figures and so forth. I think that's the approach we should be looking. That's at least one of the one of the metrics we should be taking into account.
Thank you. Okay, we've come full circle. One of the audience members says, the right to privacy and confidentiality conflicts with the right to public health. Epidemiology requires incidence and contract tracing data. Since HIPAA, and for many people outside of the United States, that's the law related to privacy of healthcare information, the balance in the United States has been heavy towards privacy and confidentiality. Data analysis requires extensive permissions and training to access databases to do independent assessments. So this person is asking, don't you think we need to rebalance it? Again, could you explain why I don't think that? It's not about balance. Can you?
It's not about balance. It's a totally legitimate question. I'm not a HIPAA expert. And I won't even play one on TV here. I think that it's really possible for us to imagine, on the one hand, the importance of contact tracing to solving the diseases, or at least limiting the spread of the disease, but also taking into account the personal health data that needs to be protected in the course of that kind of surveillance intervention. And those things are not, or at least should not be, at odds with one another. I think one of the problems in the United States is that we have so many different places where and so many different authorities that will be engaged in collecting information, that it may be a little bit more difficult if it's not centralized. I mean, there's value, and there's concern around centralization of this kind of data. But I think that as long as there is some set of meaningful principles around how to protect data and how to limit surveillance to only what is necessary to the public health crisis, to addressing the public health crisis, I think we're in a good position at least to ask the questions of the governments and the questions of the private actors doing the collecting that need to be asked. I mean, I'd be concerned because there's this proliferation of independent companies that are seeking to gather information and to sell that. And if we've learned anything about surveillance capitalism, it's that that process will be, or at least will seem to be, inexorable, and we need to protect against that being the norm, at least.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, I think there are some parallels, for example, between HIPAA and GDPR, right? Both are privacy frameworks set up to protect the consumer or the citizen. But I think that we, in addition to everything that David said, which I, as usual, completely agree with, we can look at, in the United States, for example, making sure that there are prohibitions on sharing that data with insurance firms. Right. I think here we have a lot more, and I'm just speaking from, personal experience, like, a lot more concern about how our health data could then be used against us because we don't have, universal healthcare. We don't have, a government health system like much of Europe does, and other parts of the world. And I think in Europe with the GDPR, people are concerned, tend to be more concerned about private corporate actors using data in ways that they don't agree with, but they're more willing to give governments some leeway with proper protection protections. And so I think it's, again, looking at how you put on very specific constraints, restraints on the use, sharing, et cetera, of that data. We certainly, if the governments of Europe decide that, yes, even though telecom data is protected under GDPR, we want to use that to do contract tracing, we're going to put on these very specific limitations. We're going to inform people so that, they understand, et cetera. That may cause less concern. And here, with HIPAA, if there's an understanding about what type of data is going to be shared, who that's going to be shared with, how that can be used, how it can't be used, how long is it going to be, allowed to be held for, et cetera. That, again, going back to freedom of information, proactive provision of information, transparency by the government and corporate actors about what they are and are not going to be doing, and making sure that there are actual, regulations or legislation in place, I think is really important. I personally don't think this is an area where self-regulation is going to be sufficient. We're going to want real legal constraints on how that data could be used.
Can I push a little further on this, though? In examples where firms use AI, they own and control the data, even when they're doing, let's say they're doing work. IBM Watson is doing work on behalf of the Canadian government, let's say, as example. Through licensing agreement, they own whatever data analysis they've done using public data, mix of public and private data. So is not ownership also an issue here? Ownership of data? Because that leads to reuse. Have you thought about synthetic data?
Of what kind of data?
Synthetic data. So
Mm-hmm.
researchers come up with fake data sets to mock patterns that they think exist in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak in much detail to that, but I do think that, I mean, you're raising a really important point around data protection, but also both the ownership of what's essentially private information, and also the use of that information as part of the algorithmic kind of decision making that takes place either on the platforms or in other, it's used by public authorities. And I think that this is one area where we have extremely limited insight, extremely limited transparency into what companies and governments are doing to protect the data. Now, this isn't necessarily true in the European context, where the GDPR imposes some very severe, very serious, severe makes it sound derogatory, but very serious constraints. But I do think around the world, this is certainly one of the problems, that we really just don't have too much insight into the use of, exactly the kinds of data that you're talking about and the tools that you're talking about as well.
And I mean, I would add to that as well, from, again, like, this is kind of getting beyond what CPJ works on, but as a independent researcher and an academic, I personally believe there's great value in public data remaining public, and that, if you're using part of that, if you're using public data, it's not just about private data, it's also about, this data is being collected by a government entity or via taxpayer dollars. For example, making academic articles, or, going back to, these algorithms or something, if they're based on public data that required public funding or taxpayer money to collect, that should be considered. Also the idea of how we define ownership, and again, this is getting very far beyond CPJ, but, personally thinking about how we own data, that's a framework we could choose to shift. There are a lot of conversations now about who should own data. Maybe that should reside with the individual. We should be thinking about data portability. And, most people are talking about that in the sense of, content platforms like Facebook, but we could think about that more broadly. The idea, can you own data? That's a decision, that we can make, in our capitalist democratic system, but we could also decide to make a different type of decision about ownership of data. What does that mean? Who gets to do that? How do you get to then create products that are based on that? There are many choices to be made. And I think part of the problem is that there is this anti-regulatory framework in much of American discourse that hears the word regulation and immediately thinks, oh, that's going to restrict my speech, and just, that's against American principles. But there are many things that throughout this process can be thought about, questions that we should interrogate and that we should be asking, so that we're not just assuming that data can be owned. That is a choice that we have made, but not necessarily consciously.
I know you have to go. Do you want to make, and I apologize to the people whose questions we didn't answer. Do you want to make any final statements?
Well, maybe as part of a final statement, although there's no final statements when it comes to me and Courtney.
As long as you're alive.
We're always going to state something. Maybe as sort of the final statement, I'll address one of the questions, because one of the questions asked about government responses to manage speech that incentivizes negative public health behavior. So I think this is a really important question, right? Because we're at a moment where public health authorities are saying, it's important to do physical or social distancing, which means avoid, say, public beaches, to avoid large assemblies, and so forth. And I think that that government has to basically walk a fine line here, right? Because on the one hand, they should absolutely be promoting those things that are sensitive to and promoting of public health. But they also have to be creating an enabling environment for freedom of expression. So that could mean, in the context of public assemblies, that there are going to be strict rules around distancing at public events. I mean, by that I mean, public protests, let's say. I don't think government should be in a position of, or social media, of banning those kinds of protests, but basically saying these protests are going to be legitimate so long as you meet these public health requirements. And if you don't, well, then, we can't let you continue. But that's, I think, Courtney used the word sunset earlier. Like, as long as it's a narrow restriction for a particular time and will end once the public health threat ends, then it's, to me, it can be acceptable. But all depends on government, earning our trust when it does these things. Also, social media earning our trust when it takes these kinds of steps, like Facebook did a week or two ago when it came to, event pages related to public protests of the lockdowns. I mean, those kinds of approaches need to be non-discriminatory. They need to be focused on the necessity of the public health side. They need to be limited in time. But I don't think under human rights law we can say those things are unavailable. And maybe the last thing, just to close it all out, for me at least, is governments need to be providing access to information, and to be open. They need to be open and honest with the public, in part as a tool to incentivize positive public health behaviors. That's a disincentive for the negative. And I think we need to see that more and more from governments if we can.
Yeah, and I think briefly to wrap up, and there's a question around laws and regulations being kind of behind the curve of where we are with technology, about what citizens and NGOs can do about power grabs and just what they can do. And I think it's really important that people feel empowered, and that part of it is how do you express yourself and express your opinion and create norms, because it's not, laws and regulations are not the only way that we support democracy, that we put restrictions on how private actors and governments can behave. Norms are really important as well. And so thinking about what that means in our day-to-day life, and ensuring that we are thinking about the implications of a product or of a process or a policy before they're put into place, that we're doing those human rights assessments. And I would just say, you know, a little plug for journalists, like we need them more than ever now, because we're in this very unclear information environment. We need the people who are going out and not only talking to the experts and the officials, but also on the ground doing their own observational work, so that we have that independent entities that are able to hold governments and other actors accountable. And so, you know, as we talk and we you know, honor those healthcare workers and grocers and all of the other people on the front lines, journalists are also on the front lines doing their work. And so that would also mean, like, let's stop denigrating them. Let's encourage our political leaders not to denigrate journalism and realize that it's a really fundamental part of addressing the coronavirus and the infodemic.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments. And thank you both so much for participating and taking the time to share your insights. And thank you, audience, and we'll see you soon. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, Susan.
Bye.
Thanks, Courtney. Bye.